First, up to the end of the 3rd century, the church is still not, is still struggling, right? You got persecution. They're obviously organized because there's contacts between churches on a social level, but they don't have the ability to function in an open way, of course, until Constantine comes along. And this is it's a watershed moment for the church in many ways, and certainly was also in terms of the way it dealt with its text. So, and this is kind of an interesting problem or issue to discuss, because for many people, when they hear about Constantine, it's sort of like you hear things like, oh, Constantine invented the belief that Jesus was divine. Or Constantine, under his guidance for political reasons, to get rid of the Arians and settle, various, overstatements are often made about this. But at the same time, it does have to be acknowledged that Constantine and his influence and subsequent emperors really gave space and opportunity for the church to kind of do the things that it, what would you say, needed to do in some ways. So you had significant attempts to bring the church together in ways that it couldn't before. You had the Council of Nicaea in 325, quite clearly with the goal of unity across the empire. We also have Constantine giving specific instructions, and in fact, like all good emperors, paying the bill for producing authoritative copies of the New Testament. Eusebius, who's the biographer of Constantine, he was kind of this court theologian, so you have to take everything he says with a grain of salt because he wants to keep his job. But he does relate how Constantine paid for and provided the resources for 50 copies of what he calls the sacred scriptures to be made and then passed around the major bishoprics, major cities in the empire. We're not sure if we have any of those 50 copies, but there's a pretty good chance. Many scholars think that the Codex Sinaiticus and the Codex Vaticanus, both of which are obviously deluxe and expensive and significant items, produced in the early part of the 4th century. Many scholars think that those two manuscripts might have been actually 2 of the 50 that Constantine produced. It'd be hard to tell that. But what happens is that what's undeniable historically is that for the first time you have what we now call the New Testament brought together as a single book. So it's treated as a physical and you might even say theological unity. Now Eusebius, as I mentioned earlier, still keeps this homolegumena, antilegomena distinction. And in fact, in Codex Sinaiticus, you have Shepherd of Hermas and the Epistle of Barnabas copied in the manuscript. So there's still some, you might say, debate about some books on the fringe of the canon. But you have now parchment being used to produce books, which means you can make really fat books with really big pages, which allow you to fit not only the New Testament under one cover, but also the entire Greek Old Testament in the same book, including what we call the Apocrypha, all in one big book. It's like going from flash drive to hard drive, or floppy disk to hard drive, maybe it's a better comparison. Just the technology changes. And you have very intentional and obvious efforts in the manuscripts themselves to produce a uniform text. So just, this is Vaticanus, but uniform format that gets reproduced later on, uniform scribal practices. The Codex Sinaiticus was produced by 4 different scribes working simultaneously on different sections. And if you just look at it, you wouldn't know that it was 4 different scribes. They're all professional and virtually identical, although you can eventually pick up on the differences. The manuscript itself, anybody seen it? It's in the British Library. British Library in London. It's gorgeous. Each page is about that big, 4 columns. And typically, when parchment is prepared, when it dries, if a goat or a sheep had a mosquito bite or had a cut or something, it stretches and leaves a little hole in the manuscript. And you see this all over the place. Scribes will just skip the hole and keep writing, right? Well, in Codex Sinaiticus, there's not a single leaf that has a hole in it, right? Every leaf is absolutely perfect. Given the size of the manuscript, I forget the number off the top of my head, something like 390 goats, it's goat skin, 390 goats had to die to make that manuscript. So they didn't buy it at Walmart, right? Somebody put significant resources into this, both the physical format, the skill involved in producing it, and the reason it got preserved, we don't know. It ended up in St. Catherine's Monastery in Mount Sinai sometime in probably the 6th century. But what probably happened is the bishop, whoever got this manuscript, got it and said, nobody is ever touching this again because it costs a fortune, right? Eventually it makes its way to Mount Sinai, and then, it's an interesting story how it gets to the British Library via Russia, via Germany, but anyway, now it's in the British Library. So again, the point being here, you now have what is essentially a critical edition. Because you can tell just based on the readings of the manuscripts that they're comparing different witnesses and producing a very clean, readable, edited text, maybe is a good way to say it. Vaticanus shows the same sorts of characteristics. It's not to say that this wasn't going on before. Some of the papyri are very carefully prepared, but it becomes much more consistent and widespread beginning in the 4th century. So you have, again, manuscripts compared to one another to produce authoritative copies, and what probably happened with the 50 that Constantine made was they get sent to the bishop, and then copies are produced for the diocese, or whatever you want to call them, locally. So it's an attempt to standardize. And as I mentioned, it was the New Testament, as we now know it, is collected together for the first time. So pretty significant both for church history, but also for the history of the text, because the church now has, for better or for worse, resources to do this. In the third period, really beginning in the 5th century, you have the split between the Western Church and the Eastern Church, which was sort of already in place with Constantine. He split it for administrative purposes, but it became effectively two different political organizations, two different political entities by the 5th, 6th century. The Western Church is now using exclusively Latin, had been using Greek up until the middle of the 3rd century, but now is using only Latin. There's all kinds of translations being made because many people are bilingual and can take a Greek text and turn it into Latin without too much difficulty. So there's all kinds of translations of the Latin New Testament, Gospels of Paul especially. So Pope Damasus in 382 asks Jerome to produce an authoritative translation. He does so. He actually goes to Bethlehem, learns Hebrew from a rabbi, and translates from Hebrew, which got a lot of people angry because he translated accurately, where the Septuagint had been a little more freeform. In fact, here's one of my favorite text-critical stories, which you could put this on your top 10 list, Terry. The first time Jerome's Vulgate was read from the book of Jonah, he translated, when Jonah is angry, he sits down and the gourd tree grows up and covers him. And I forget which way it goes, but the Septuagint used the wrong word in the translation. So the Latin translated the wrong word. And Jerome translated the right way, with the proper word. And when it was, there's this true story, it's in the church history thing. When the congregation heard this new translation of Jonah, and it wasn't the gourd tree, they rushed the pastor and told him to bring the old translation back. It was almost a riot because of the textual variant. For the good old days, It's like changing to a new hymnal, or putting a screen up or something. Anyway, So the Pope says we need to fix this, we need to get a standard text, and he commissions Jerome, who makes this translation. We're not sure if he did the epistles. He certainly did the Old Testament and the Gospels and the Apocrypha. The epistles only sort of got a light touch. Those weren't too bad. But in any event, it takes some time for this to become entrenched because people like their old translations. But eventually this becomes the standard text for the Western Church. And really, virtually all Latin copies until the Renaissance are this Vulgate text. You have some regional differences. There's a Spanish version, there's an Italian version, there's a Bodensee, Switzerland version, there's an Irish version, but they're all within the ballpark. They're all pretty darn close. So essentially, by 400, let's say 450, the Western Church has its Bible in Latin. And so you can understand Luther coming along and translating from Greek, or Erasmus putting out a Greek text a few years earlier. That's a pretty big move. No one has done that, gone aside from the Latin. The Latin text simply was the authoritative text, and we'll come back to that in a second here. We do have one Vulgate manuscript at Concordia Seminary, which is kind of cool, although it's not really important, but it's kind of cool to have. Of course, now we have a billion of them in Oklahoma City. But anyway, the Eastern Church at the same time really begins to settle on its own form of the text. And here in the East, because the empire continues really until the fall of Constantinople in, was it 1451? Right? The Roman Empire, they called themselves the Roman Empire. They really were the heirs of that. So for the next 1,000 years, you had the Roman Empire continuing in the East, and the church as essentially an arm of the state. Funded by the state, the monastic system is supported, churches are supported, the priests are all supported by the state. So, and as agents of the state, for better or for worse, you're going to have a uniform system. So the Greek Orthodox Church settles on a specific form of the text. Starts in the 6th century. It's really finalized probably in the 9th century when the Catholic epistles are revised. But virtually every manuscript produced after 900 is essentially identical in Greek, except for scribal mistakes. There's very little editing in a kind of change of reading sense. All you'll see pretty much from about 900 to 1,000 on in Greek manuscripts are scribal errors. And again, it's because they had the system to support that, to train the scribes, to produce the materials. The monastic system that needed hundreds of manuscripts of the Bible for their liturgical use. So they're all pretty standard. This is generic. This is what, a 12th century. There's the Gospel of Matthew. They developed a specific handwriting style, minuscule script, which you probably can't read, but it's really fast to write. So you see letters are connected. So so beginning of Matthew, and much faster to write than uncial, which is a single letter at a time. So these are kind of mass produced, at least for that kind of technology. What's interesting is when they had, parchment was valuable, so when they had a manuscript that they didn't need anymore because the text didn't match what was now the liturgical text, they would take it and wash it off and reuse it. A palimpsest, it's called. So here's underneath, you can see kind of faintly, it's a 5th century text of Matthew, but they washed it off and rewrote it actually upside down. And this is a patristic text, I forget which church father. But they reused the parchment and washed off the biblical text again because it didn't match their liturgical text form. They were that kind of interested in standardizing the text for liturgical use. It's kind of like, again, everybody adopting ESV and getting rid of their NIVs. It's kind of what you're doing. Similar move. It's not that different, but different enough, I guess. So in this third period, roughly from 5th century to the Reformation, little variation. both in Latin and in Greek. The standard editions produced in the 5th century are perpetuated really for the next 1,000 years. And the reason this is important to note is that this is why numbers do not matter, why numbers of manuscripts do not matter when it comes to deciding which reading is more authentic, right? Because the vast, vast majority of manuscripts were produced all within this closed system to intentionally be identical to each other, and it's based on a revision done in the 5th century. So it's sort of like an analogy I used. Would you rather have a Porsche or 150 Yugos? Take your pick, you know. I'd probably rather have a Porsche. So the Byzantine text is kind of your 150 Yugos. They're all the same, and they did their job. But a 2nd century manuscript is much more fun. I'll use that word. So here's a rough list. This could be adapted here or there, and some of the dating's a little bit off, but to give you some idea relationally. 2nd and 3rd century, roughly 40 manuscripts. There might be a couple more we could throw into that category. The 2nd period, when things are being standardized, you see roughly, I'll say 100 manuscripts still exist today. But then you get into the 6th, 7th, and 8th, that's where they're rewashing everything and reusing stuff. But then look, 10th century, 146, 11th, 441, 588, 573, 538. Hundreds and hundreds of manuscripts being produced for all these monasteries on Mount Athos and Mount Tiburon and all these, you know, dozens of monasteries, each needing a manuscript, a biblical manuscript. It drops off in the 15th century. You might guess because of Gutenberg, but in fact, the Greek Orthodox Church kept making biblical manuscripts by hand for the next 100 years. Wow. What changed was the invasion of Islam. And all these monasteries got overrun, and these churches got overrun, and they weren't producing manuscripts anymore. So it wasn't actually the printing press that ended it until later. It was really the loss of the Byzantine Empire to Islam. Once Constantinople fell, it was pretty much it. And of course, then you get into the Reformation and Vienna and all that kind of stuff with the emperor. So again, numbers of manuscripts don't really matter because we know why these are being produced in such large quantities, and that they're all really deriving from the same single source. So textually, that's why in your apparatus you see that Gothic M for majority. Well, it's a German word, but it's because these all really come from a single source, essentially. They all sort of count as one witness for that reason. Although that's starting to change a little bit. So yeah, 1,000 years are pretty much the same thing. So what was going on with the text during this time? How is it being handled? What kind of changes were occurring in the manuscripts? You know, causes of corruption. Why were things changed? Or didn't they know it's the Bible? Right? Why are they making changes to the biblical text? Some of them are intentional. Some of them are not intentional. And tracing these through can be a pretty fascinating exercise. So a couple things to keep in mind. I talked about this earlier. In the early period, scribes considered the living voice, the viva voce, you see this in the church fathers, of the apostles to be of greater authority than the written text. Papias flat out makes a statement in 110. The written text is, at least to somebody in the Roman period, easily altered, and you can't verify its testimony. It's an anonymous, flawed thing. Whereas a human being, you can check out what they say, you can ask them, right? But a manuscript, it's not trustworthy. So editors or readers, copyists are copyists. We need to keep this in mind. Copyists are just making a copy. They'll make unintentional errors. But occasionally, editors and readers of these texts would see themselves as fixing a text if they didn't think it made sense, or might have been tampered with by heretics, or caused confusion. So let me give you one example. If you got your Bibles, you can do this in English or Greek, either one. Acts 8 is is a good example of this. It's a familiar story. It's the Ethiopian eunuch. And it's that great part where as they're going along the road, they came upon some water, and the eunuch said, "Look, water, what prevents me from being baptized?" And then there's verse 38. There's no 37, right? It goes from 36 to 38. Philip orders to be stopped the chariot, coming down, both coming down into the water. Philip says to the eunuch, right, baptize. Well, verse 37, if you look in your apparatus, is the Ethiopian eunuch making his confession of faith. And you see it down there. What prevents me from being baptized? Philip said to him, if you believe with your whole heart, it is permitted. Answering, he said, I believe Jesus to be the Son of God. Jesus Christ to be the Son of God. Now, it just happens that that's one of the questions in the baptismal liturgy for the Greek Orthodox Church. So here you have this problem of the guy saying, what prevents me from being baptized? And Philip doesn't get his confession. So it probably happened is somebody put a marginal note saying, oh, here's where the confession thing goes. And somebody later on comes along and sticks it in the text. It only occurs in a handful of manuscripts. The earliest of which is 6th century. It doesn't occur in church fathers. Even the majority text doesn't have it. It's in a handful of manuscripts. But the one manuscript that Erasmus had in 1516 included that verse. And so it ended up in the Greek New Testament. It ended up in the King James. And so it got a verse number in 1551. And now editors, I think correctly, argue that it is not part of the original text. And we're missing a verse 37. Okay. But that's a good example. That's not an accidental error. Somebody didn't accidentally add a verse or accidentally delete a verse. There's reasons in the context of church history that somebody is filling in the story. And the book of Acts is actually the one that is most prone to this kind of thing, partly because it's narrative and partly because it wasn't as widely used liturgically for preaching as the Gospels were. So it's just true of the manuscript tradition that there tends to be more variance in the book of Acts. But that's a kind of a classic example of that. Second, related factor in all this copying is that making an accurate copy of a text is a difficult thing, right? Finding an accurate copy is probably even more difficult. And so when a scribe came upon a text, he naturally presumed it was full of mistakes, like I mentioned from Augustine earlier. The first task of the interpreter is the correction of his copy. And so for an editor of the text who's trying to produce a good copy, he's not thinking he's changing it. He's an editor. He's fixing the text with the limited resources that he has. And so there's a lot of this, again, kind of on a micro level, word by word sort of things, fixing, especially grammatical, but sometimes wording issues in the text. And so you see this in the manuscripts that they're routinely annotated by their users, again, because of number 2. They're fixing things as they go. So a scribe coming across an annotated or corrected manuscript would not be sure if a notation was a correction to the original or a later corruption. So you see this all over. This is Codex Sinaiticus in Ephesians 1. And it's the famous question of, does Ephesians have an addressee? This textual variant with anapheso. So it's addressed, right, to the Church of God, to the saints. There's anpasi as an addition, and then here's anapheso, right? So Codex Sinaiticus, as well as P46, do not have anapheso in the text. There's no addressee for the letter. But here it is written in the margin, along with the anpasi. Right? There's another one down here. So if you're going to make a copy of this, you got to make a decision. Do you copy all these little notes, or do you not? Do you copy half of them, 3/4 of them, right? The next copy is going to be a somewhat random version of this manuscript. That one's going to get corrected. It's going to be a somewhat random version of that manuscript. You see how this kind of works. But again, it's with good intentions. It's because they think they're fixing what somebody else messed up in the Bible, that they're doing this. It's not like, hey, let's change the Bible or something like this. They're well aware that copyists make mistakes. They know that heretics messed with the text, and so they're trying to produce a good edition. It just caused, because of the technology, it just caused all kinds of confusion. Right? This is a fundamental reason why, we'll talk about this tomorrow, why scholars restore the text working one reading at a time. Because copyists and editors are making changes one passage at a time. They're not making changes verses at a time, they're making changes a couple of words at a time. And so, a manuscript might well be absolutely right in the first half of the verse and have picked up somebody else's change in the second half of the verse, right? So it's called an eclectic text. You're selecting from different witnesses to produce a text, as opposed to what you have in the Hebrew Old Testament, a diplomatic text, which is just a reproduction of the Leningrad Codex. So again, this just sort of caused a ripple effect in the manuscript tradition, and you can see why in the 6th and 7th century they said, let's just fix this. Let's just make one standard text, train our scribes, and leave it alone, right? So you can see why they would do that, and it was effective, right? They just picked up on the best readings, at least as they saw it in the 6th century, and produced a standard form of the text. Again, scribes vary greatly in their skill. Some were professionally copied, Sinaiticus, P46, Vaticanus, obviously people who know what they're doing. Other manuscripts, especially, Revelation is a classic example. There are 3 or maybe 4 manuscripts of Revelation from the 3rd and 4th century, but they're all produced by, untrained scribes. And you can tell because, the lines aren't quite straight on the page. They kind of fall down the side of the page. It's not quite straight. And you dip your pen in the ink and it's very dark. And then you write too long and it gets light. And then he dips his pen and it's dark and then light. Whereas a professional scribe, he keeps it even the whole way through. So Revelation is being copied really for personal use or popular use rather than liturgical or some kind of official use. And it actually kind of fits Revelation's status, in the 3rd, 4th century. It's kind of in the canon, but not really. And, it's like the Left Behind series in the 4th century or something. Everybody's reading it, but it's not really, by and large, the Gospel and Pauline manuscripts are pretty well done. You don't see too many poorly copied manuscripts for the Gospels and Paul. You tend to see it with the Antilegomena writings. And finally, Book of Ecclesiastes, he's actually talking about copying text, right? Beyond this, my son, be warned, the making of many books is endless, and much study is wearying to the flesh. It's a seminarian's favorite verse, right? But it's the making of many books. It just never ends, right? The end of the book, thanks be to God. It's just hard work and not all that fun. So, we got to cut them a little bit of slack with all this, because with the technology they had, and the means available to them to produce a good text, they actually did a pretty remarkable job. This is going to sound strange to say, but the more I study this, the more I'm amazed that it didn't turn out much worse than it did. If you look at what could have happened with the text and what did happen with some other texts in the ancient world, with interpolations and wild revisions going on, it's actually pretty amazing how consistent things actually turned out, especially in that early period, given what could have happened. So let me give you a couple of fun ones. Well, okay, fun is relative to a textual critic, but bear with me. So, and these are all, by the way, completely meaningless in terms of interpretation. So, 1 Corinthians 6:20, right, should I take my members united? So, you are bought at a price, glorify, therefore, God in your body. In the Greek manuscripts, the word is day, but every Latin manuscript ever produced that we have has, in place of glorify therefore God in your body, says glorify and carry God in your body, or glorify and pick up God in your body, talata, which is bizarre, right? First of all, how do you pick up God in your body, right? And second, where did that come from? Every single Latin manuscript has that, and not a single Greek manuscript has it. But what happened, see, you can kind of trace this out, is a substitution for day, therefore, which is a pretty uncommon conjunction, is aragea. You see it there in Codex Sinaiticus, aragea, which also means therefore. But you notice that the gamma and the tau are pretty similar looking. You're just missing a little hook at the top. So what happened is somebody wrote ara te instead of aragea in 1 Corinthians 6, and that single change is now reflected in every Latin manuscript without fail. And in fact, even Tertullian, who was writing before the Latin was completed, and he's kind of translating the Greek as he goes into Latin, even he has talata at that place and not therefore. So somehow, probably in North Africa, where the Latin versions came from at first, a single manuscript made this one little half of a line mistake, and every Latin manuscript has it as a result. So you can tell your wife, I'm sure she'd be thrilled to hear about that. Yeah. Here's another example. And that's just, again, that's a simple mistake. There's nothing intentional about that, right? But you have all these, you read through the church fathers, and everybody's talking about what does it mean to carry God in your body. I mean, they're actually like trying to figure this out, which is kind of a strange phrase. And they're, carry God in your body. Okay, well, anyway, you can preach on that one if you want. Another thing, and this is actually pretty common, is simply trying to make sense of the syntax. As you well know, reading Paul in Greek can be pretty frustrating because he likes to make sentences run on from like Ephesians 1:3 to 11 is one sentence, And so what scribes tended to do was get tired and clean things up. But I won't go into detail on this, but here's an example where it's 1 Corinthians 15:2. It doesn't mean anything, but he kind of does one of his little parentheses, right? Through which also you are saved, by which word we gospel to you, and then he keeps going. It's sort of an awkward parenthetical insertion into the flow of the sentence. So some manuscripts simply stop, put a period, through which word also you are saved, by which word we gospel to you, you ought to be saved. So instead of, what is the reading here? Yeah, instead of a katakata, they have ophelata. You ought to be saved with the infinitive, katakain, right? Which solves the problem of the parentheses and doesn't change the meaning at all. So it probably happened is somebody just got it in their head and made sense of the syntax in their head and then wrote it out, and that's what we ended up with. That occurs only in a handful of manuscripts, all of which date from the 5th and the 9th centuries. So you think, that's just late, don't have to worry about it. Except P46, which is our earliest manuscript of Paul's letters, stumbles here in 1 Corinthians 15. So you notice, you see that light? Yeah, there is. You see that line, right? You got the human there, humin, that's why I know that. You got the humin, and then he put this gap, and he wrote katekain, which is the infinitive that you see in those 3 late manuscripts. He dotted it out, see those dots over it, that omits it. And then he writes a kadekada. So then he puts the right reading in there. So what's going on? He has a manuscript that has both readings in it. One of them is a correction and one is whatever the original, we don't know which one. He stumbles over it, has to figure out which one he wants to do, and then he dots it out, figures it out, and keeps going. Now what's important about that is not so much the reading, who cares, it doesn't change the meaning at all. I mean, I care, but it doesn't really matter. But this is our earliest manuscript of Paul, but it's at least a 3rd generation witness because it has two different readings in it, the other of which doesn't show up until the 6th century. I mean, you see what I'm saying? There's at least 2 generations before this manuscript, one of which doesn't show up in a physical manuscript until the 6th century. So this is why date is pretty much irrelevant, at least for some manuscripts, when you talk about the date of a manuscript, because this is our earliest manuscript of Paul, but it's at least a 3rd generation manuscript, probably more. Right? So it's, anyway, you pick up on things that scribes are trying to figure out. When you get to the 5th century, 4th and 5th century, they start to, notice this is 2nd century, 3rd century, and still no spaces between words or punctuation, right? When you start to get into the 4th and especially 5th century, they start to put things into sense lines for public reading. Obviously laid out in a, not quite a lectionary kind of way, but line by line, so you put the pauses in the right place. And here's a good example of this. This is Codex Claromontanus, probably 5th century. It's a Greek-Latin bilingual, Greek on one side, Latin on the other. And this sort of goes to extremes in laying things out. So this is, again, 1 Corinthians 6, in that list of people who will not inherit the kingdom of God. And rather than just reading the text straight through, he breaks each one up. So, Uda, pornoi, right, Uda, idolatrata, there we go. So neither the sexually immoral, the idolaters, put them each on a line so that the reader pauses in each one to make sure that the law has its full effect on people, right? You know. What's also interesting about this is it kind of gives you clues to how they're reading the text at the time. So notice here, you got the Uda, moi, koi, de, malakoi. So that's the famous 2 words about the, one is the, so it's the homosexual activity. One is the active partner, one is the passive. I'd rather not give details, but that's the, interestingly, they put the 2 on the same line as if it's the same thing. So they're not seeing this as 2 separate activities. They're seeing it as, I'm sorry, I'm going to stop there. I'm just going to stop. Anyway, now they're laying it out for reading, right? And actually, this manuscript is unique because it has ook and oh no, it's not this one. It's a different place where he actually makes the first and the last identical, and the ones in the middle are different. And so he's obviously doing this kind of for visual purposes, and not because he thinks it's the right reading. In other words, he's using the layout to change the text rather than the other way around. Now you also see problem solving. So here's one that turn to John 1:34. It'll be interesting to see the new edition of John is supposed to be out here. Well, it's about 2 years overdue, but it might be out any time now. And I'm pretty sure this is going to be a change in the new edition. So it's John the Baptist, familiar passage again. I have seen and I have testified, so John's using all these perfects again, that this guy is the Son of God. All very straightforward, nice testifying of John. If you look in the apparatus, in verse 34, the alternative reading, instead of the Son of God, is ha eklektos, the chosen one of God. And it's read in Sinaiticus, original hand, and then a bunch of old Latin witnesses, and the old Syriac witnesses. So translations done around the year 200, and then Codex Sinaiticus. Now, the question you ask, or that a textual critic would ask, is why would somebody change it from huios to eklektos? Right? What's the problem with a word like eklektos? Remember your seminary days, right? What's one of the earliest Christian heresy, actually, earliest Christological heresy? What's that? Adoptionism, exactly. That Jesus was adopted as Son of God in his baptism. So here you have John the Baptist saying that this guy is the chosen one of God, and what's the verb they used? Eklegomai, right? Eklektos, right? It's the heretical word. So your options are either Huios was original, Son of God was original, and a heretic, or an idiot, put eclectus, or eclectus was what John wrote, and then somebody realized this could be misused by the heretics, and they put in Huios, which John uses again and again and again and again, right? So it's perfectly safe, right? And it actually kind of makes sense here that John is saying, yeah, this guy is the one sent by God, eclectus in that sense. You know, not necessarily, he's not talking about his pre-divinity, because he already did that in the first 18 verses. It's not a problem. But the single verse could be misused, and I would probably come down on saying that it's probably eclectus, and it got changed to Huios. So those are, again, a word by word. It could be misread, so somebody just fix it to make sure it wasn't misread, would be a way to say it. Yeah.
Does my textual apparatus indicate that the Latin try to synthesize both of them?
Yeah, so electus filius, yeah, just put them both in there. The elect Son of God.
Himself, right?
Yeah, sells everything, just put them both in there. Yeah. And the Sahidic does that too. So it's a very early reading, so that's the problem. It's all 2nd century readings. And what do you do with that? Another example, and this is probably more familiar, if you turn to Mark 1, verse 2. And this one, doesn't matter at all really, but so the introduction to the quotations from the Old Testament, just as it is written in Isaiah the prophet, and then the text quoted, if you look in your margin, is of course not from Isaiah, right? It's from Malachi. And then a voice crying in the wilderness, Isaiah 40. And so if you read the majority text, or if you read the King James, which is based on the majority text, it's going to say, as it is written in the prophets, plural, which neatly solves the problem of saying it's from Isaiah and then quoting Malachi, right? However, now we know that in the ancient world, if you're going to cite a catena or a chain of sources, you will attribute it, no matter where it's from, to either the most important of those sources or the last one you cite. So you got Malachi, Isaiah, who's more important, who's more prominent, right? Isaiah, what's the last one? Isaiah, right? Mark is doing just what a 1st century writer would do, but for somebody who's fastidious about making sure it's attributed correctly, says, oh, wait a minute, this is actually prophets. So those are some of the kind of problem-solving things that you see, and again, on occasion. These are not common in that sense of the word. I don't need to go through a whole lot of those. You got some grammar issues. 1 Corinthians 7 is another parenthetical thing. They stick a chi in there to fix it. Mark 1:41, is Jesus angry or is he moved by compassion? 1 Timothy 3 is the famous one. Do this quickly. Who was incarnate in the flesh? You see the theta sigma up there with a line over it? That's the way they would write theos. It's called a nomina sacra, a holy name. And you see another one up there, theon. They would put the first and the last letters of theos, Jesus, Christos, Kyrios, those 4 words. And it's almost like the tetragrammaton in Hebrew manuscripts, where the name Yahweh is not written and it's not pointed, so it stands out. In many ways, it's the same thing. You look at a page and you can tell if it's a Christian manuscript immediately if you see these things. Only Christians did this. Now, the problem is theos is an easy change from Omicron Sigma, hus, right? So in 1 Timothy 3, who was manifest in the flesh? Hus, right? Well, if somebody came along and put a line through the Omicron and a bar over it, and now you got God incarnate in the flesh. So the Byzantine text has God incarnate in the flesh. The King James has God incarnate in the flesh. But if you look at your ESV or your Nestle text, it has hus, who was incarnate in the flesh, manifest in the flesh. Okay. So again, Pretty simple substitution, pretty easy to track out how that happened. Mentioned this earlier, a lot of parallelism between Matthew and Luke, that the wording gets adapted. Word order changes are all over the place. They're not even worth, the Nestle apparatus hardly notes them. I mean, they do a few, but generally they're not critical to meaning, but they happen all over the place. Although to Jim Belts, again, they matter significantly, but we won't get into that. The number of editions is actually, and again, in relative terms compared to other literature, pretty small. In fact, the big ones you always hear about are the woman caught in adultery in John 7, the ending of Mark, 1 John 5, and then Johannine, comma, the Trinitarian formula in 1 John 5. And then there's, I think there's 24 or 26 entire verses that are omitted from the critical text that are found in the Byzantine text. But, I think 90% of those are parallels from the other gospel that are inserted into Mark or Luke or whichever other gospel. So they're present in another gospel, they're just inserted into the other one. The other significant one is John 5, where the pool of Bethesda is there. And P66 actually has this, the description of the angel stirring the waters. Yeah, it's a textual variant, a whole verse and a half. And may well be somebody just sort of adding some color commentary to it. Although I think the ESV includes that verse. I don't remember, John 5. Does it? No? Wow. They have a footnote? Yeah. Yeah. Conflations, these happen all the time, comparing things. So, I mean, this is your pretty typical, again, the vast majority of these, it's pretty easy to figure out at least what they're trying to do, whether or not you can tell which one is the original reading or not. Typical scribal activity or editorial activity is pretty typical. Now, the other thing that is, I think, important to point out before we move on to printed texts, and this sounds very postmodern, but bear with me. The early church fathers actually had virtually no difficulty in places where there were two readings and just leaving them both. Origen does this, Jerome does this, Augustine does it, he's a little too worked up. But they frequently will comment, because they're scholars, they have access to multiple manuscripts, they have copies that have corrections in it, and they will often just simply comment on both passages and never say which one is right. So in Romans 5, death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those whose sinning was not like the transgression of Adam. The variant is, whose sinning was like the transgression of Adam. Okay, you leave it a not, it's a big change, right? So Origen's commentary in Romans, he says, right, if on the other hand, as it reads in some manuscripts, even in those who did not sin in the likeness of Adam's transgression, this death, namely with that which was keeping souls bound, and he goes on and on, but he never says which reading is right. He simply says, well, if it is those who did sin in the likeness of Adam, it means this, and if it's those who did not sin, it means this. And then he keeps going. Right, which is really tough on us Westerners, because only one thing can be right. But he does it several times. As I said, Jerome does it. Ambrosiaster does it, who actually gets quoted in the Confessions. I mean, not the variant, but yeah, it's not uncommon for church fathers to just let them both run. Yeah.
Of all the variants you're talking about, how many would reputable scholars say anything different?
Would reputable scholars, of which there are none, by the way, but keep going.
No, I'm wondering, of all the variants that you're pointing out, this one versus that one would be this, are there any reputable scholars making a big deal about doctrinally?
Doctrinally? Well, I think that John 1:34, and again, keep in mind, and we'll talk about this a bit tomorrow.
You already had John 1:18.
Yeah, you already had it there, right? And he's called Son of God, what, 6 other times in John, you know? So it's, it's not really an issue. This is the way I think we need to say it is, there are times where a difference in a manuscript does affect the meaning, and that could have theological implications. However, even if you take the Ekleptos reading, you can read that in an orthodox way. And you have the whole testimony of the rest of John, let alone the rest of the scriptures, to sort that out. So sort of your scripture interprets scripture, dealing with text critical problems.
That's what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
Big picture question. There's so many variations. You
Right.
really can't trust it.
Yeah. So the upshot is nothing I say actually matters. Now, I will say, and this is only sort of tongue-in-cheek, but the place where you find the most unique readings, that is, that don't sort of fit other things, actually is in the ending of Mark. So every other thing in the longer ending of Mark, like Jesus appearing to the disciples, he appears in an upper room, he sends the disciples, all that's in Luke or Acts or Matthew. What you don't have is drinking poison and picking up snakes. So go ahead, I mean, if you want, but you don't have a scripture interpret scripture on that. You're kind of on your own. And I say that only sort of half jokingly, but it does demonstrate that there aren't very many places where it's all that strange or unique. And by and large, when it is strange and unique, it's so obviously wrong. I had a great one. Gibbs showed me. Jeff Gibbs pointed this out a few years back. He's working on his Matthew commentary, and Jesus says, "No sign will be given to you except the sign of Jonah," the Semaion. And some scribe wrote there, "Ploion." No sign will be given to you except the boat of Jonah. He's like, "Jeff, I found this variant." I'm like, "Yeah, that's really stupid." "I know, isn't it awesome?" I mean, obviously that's wrong. Who knows what the heck the guy was thinking? The boat of Jonah, I mean, I guess it makes sense, but come on. Make sure you hear me right. There are passages that have theological import that have variants, but we don't operate that way, right? We don't read the Bible that way. We read the Bible, as a whole within its larger context, as we come into any individual passage. Anything else on these kind of changes? I could do this all night. You guys would go to sleep, so I'll stop here.
Just one quick one.
Yeah.
Origen and Jerome, their willingness to let both texts stand, is that an indication then that they also understood that the church as a whole had these two texts and they were not willing to?
Yeah, it's not, they don't really comment on the fact that they let them stand. They don't have some kind of theology of the word behind that. But I mean, so I'll fill in what I think it is. But I think it does reflect because these guys are hugely competent scholars. I mean, they're two of the best textual scholars in the early church. There's no question. Origen and Jerome. So it's not like they're not taking the text seriously. They're not hacks or but it does reflect, I think, a humility before the text. And I think this actually explains a lot of the conflations where two things get put together. Because the scribe will say, well, there's two things here and they're both kind of good. I don't want to be the guy to mess this up. And so he puts them both down, right? It's actually a respect for the word that they don't want to lose anything. So they leave them both. And I think that's exactly what Origen's doing here. He gives you an interpretation for both. What tends to happen, though, and you see this in the manuscripts, is they gradually get bigger, right? Because, slightly because the words keep getting conflated and added, and they don't lose anything. So the Byzantine text is classically known for conflate and double readings and longer text. Well, it's because they're, again, not wanting to lose stuff, I think, out of respect for the word. So it's kind of ironic, right? They're creating a new reading because they love the word, rather than risking losing something. Yeah.
Just to ask a question about the copies and how they did their work. Is it, they had a copy on the table next to them?
Yeah, great question.
Style line by line, or was there 10 of them in a room? And
Yeah, excellent question. So so you read like Metzger's text of the New Testament from 1964, I think it first came out, and that's kind of the scenario he writes. You got a guy reading, and you got people taking it by dictation. The problem is there's not a single description in the ancient world of anybody ever doing that. And the book trade really isn't set up that way. It's more kind of private sellers or private lenders kind of thing. There are paintings, well, here's one. This is Codex Amiatinus. It's a 5th century, 5th or 6th century Latin gospel manuscript. And it's a picture of Ezra the scribe, but it's probably a scribe making a self-portrait. In any event, it shows you how somebody in the 5th century would be copying a book. He's got a bookcase there, and you see how they don't have perspective, so the shelves are slanted up so you can see the books on it. The books are laying flat, right, because they're not, they don't have covers the way we have it. And he's sitting there, and he's got his pen. Notice he's kind of hunched up on his knees. He's got a little footstool to keep his feet propped up so he has a place to put the book. And he has something here, like a book stand, which he's probably copying from, even though there's a piece of art there. So here's how he's working, eye to eye to eye to eye to eye, back and forth. And it doesn't look very comfortable to me, but this is obviously how they're copying in the 5th century. I mean, that's what it is. It's a scene from the 5th century. By himself, no dictation. And the kinds of errors you see, the unintentional errors, tend to be those kind of sight things. There's way more sight things than there are sound things. Even if the scribe is sort of reading out loud to himself, most of the errors tend to be sight rather than sound errors. And then, so really there is no indication of kind of a dictation copying. Which is interesting because Paul clearly dictates to Tertius and others for his letters, but that doesn't seem to be how they made the copies. That's a single scribal activity. Yeah.
One variant that my mind just kind of came to was we have the Lord's Prayer in King James all the time. Can you just walk through how we got that edition again? I think I probably learned it from you in seminary, but I forgot.
Really? You forgot something from the seminary? Yeah. Well, short story is there's two versions. Matthew has the familiar one. Luke has a shorter one. Our Father, and then on to the next. So it's about 2/3 the length of the one in Matthew. But of course later manuscripts copy Matthew's version into Luke, so they match, right? The "For thine is the kingdom, power and glory, right, forever," doesn't occur until much later in the manuscript tradition, but it does occur in the it's in the Didache. Somebody check me on that. The Lord's Prayer in the Didache, which is kind of an early form of how worship goes, and probably it's like we used to do in TLH. You recite the Lord's Prayer, the pastor recites the Lord's Prayer, and the congregation sings the response. That's probably what it was. And then it got added into the manuscripts of Matthew, made it into Erasmus text, made it into the King James. So that's a good example of kind of liturgical influence shaping the text. There's a couple variants actually in 1 Corinthians 11, the Lord's Supper passage, that are probably also liturgical influenced, as well as in Luke, there's a couple. But again, it's not surprising if they're doing this Sunday after Sunday to see some of these things make their way into the text over 1,500 years. I mean, you'd be surprised if it didn't, actually. But the Lord's Prayer is a good one. It's, they're so familiar with it. You're going to see these things come up. Yeah.
I'm from a Roman Catholic background.
Yeah.
Their contention has always been that sacred tradition equals Scripture and even transcends it, because you have that oral tradition, those living witnesses, and the aftermath of the apostles, before you have a completed text.
Yeah.
How would you answer to that argument of Scripture and tradition, or even tradition transcending Scripture?
Yeah. Well, I mean, factually, I mean, it's just fact, right? The apostles are in AD 30, or pick your date, but probably AD 30. And the first New Testament writing is at best 40. Paul's letters don't start until 48, and he finishes in 63. So you have at least, right, 10 to 20 for the Gospels, maybe 30 years, where there's nothing written down, and all you have are apostles. I mean, that's factually correct, right? I mean, we can agree on that. Now, does that mean that there's some kind of secret deposit of apostolic testimony that doesn't make it into the text, and now, you know, we have access to independent from the text? That's a whole other move, which I think is problematic, right? The fact that the scriptures follow the church, well, better said, follows the Holy Spirit, is simply, you can't gainsay that, right? It's what do you do theologically with the authority question that's the real problem. You see does that get at your question? Yeah. So for Lutherans, if you just want to rehearse it, right? Scripture is the norma normans, right? The normie norm. And any other testimony, right? Even we are an angel from heaven, says Paul. If he says something else, let it be anathema. So everything else is normed by that, including tradition. Rome just says, no, we got this other thing going alongside. And see, again, the key difference is, for Lutherans, for Protestants, we'll say Lutherans because that's us, it's the authority of the Word centered in Christ. For the Roman Church, it's the authority of the office. And so you have to have some kind of authority vested in the office separate from the Word.
Right. It would just seem to me that it's no coincidence that when the book of Revelation, the last one, is written, that almost right directly after that, you've got the death of the last apostle, that being the last apostle qualifications which they had seen before.
Yeah, that all works. Yeah, I mean, you got to deal with Mark and Luke somehow, but because they're not apostles. But no, there's something to that. They're certainly written during the apostolic period, and the teaching of the apostles is. I mean, Papias talks about this. He says, "Look, I talked to John the Elder. I asked him if this stuff was true. You know, he had the Gospels, and then John comes to town and he asks him. So they're certainly checking into this stuff over and against. You know, the written stuff is being confirmed by what they know is the true apostolic teaching." Yeah.
That raises the question, who is the real author of Revelation? Is it John the Elder, Presbyter, or is it John the Apostle?
Yeah, I'm a textual scholar. I don't care. Sorry, Yeah, it's a great question. I don't want to just blow it off, but it's a very good question, and I'm not going to answer it because I don't know. I mean, you know. I can give you the arguments, but you know, I don't know. Yeah, anything else on the manuscripts? Yeah.
Given that we have so many more New Testament texts plowing through that,
Yeah.
how does the accuracy of the variants of the New Testament compare to variations in other classical texts?
Good. So variations in other classical texts. So if you see on a website somewhere that the New Testament texts are way more numerous and less variant than other ancient texts, just disregard it completely. Okay. The same things you see going on in New Testament texts you see going on in every textual tradition. The difference is how many witnesses there are, which is natural. The more witnesses, the more variants you're going to have. There are some statements about how well attested the New Testament is more than other texts. That was true 100 years ago. And then he started digging up all these papyri, which we now have from the New Testament. But by the way, we found all kinds of papyri for Aristotle and for Homer. And so actually Aristotle's text we can get to within 100 years of his writing as well, from some early papyri.
His writings or his students' notes?
No, these are Aristotle, and actually he produced an edition, kind of a second edition of his writings, and we have manuscripts from both traditions. So, Plato, I don't know about that. No comment. I don't know the answer. But for Aristotle, there's definitely outstanding manuscript witnesses to Aristotle. I mean, there's maybe even better, frankly, than some of the new, like Mark. We don't have much on Mark prior to 400 or prior to 300. It's not very well attested in the manuscripts, just randomly. But Aristotle has better manuscript testimony than we have from Mark, for example. So I wouldn't use the sort of, oh, we have so much stuff as if the Holy Spirit was guiding this and now we can dismiss everything else or something. It's just being copied like every text, which is good. Yeah. Yeah, I would, how did you do that? It's not my presentation.
He's in the tech.
Yeah, well, first of all, I mean, do you really want me to deconstruct this? So 24,000 New Testament manuscripts, all right. The number of Greek manuscripts that we have for any given book is at best probably about 1,000, maybe 1,500 for John. So, okay, we have all these New Testament manuscripts, but there's only 1,500 or so Greek manuscripts of John. That 24,000 is going to include all the Latin, all the Syriac, every translation ever made. That's not even close to a real number. The number of manuscripts we have for James is something like 400. And again, you have a couple very early and then nothing till the medieval period. So it's sort of a it's a wax nose point. I don't even know how you can say there's only 7 manuscripts of Plato. The Homer one is probably close. I'd like to know when this was put together. 1400 is wrong for Plato, I'll tell you that. Thucydides, they found papyri. I mean, this might be based on some older data, but it's certainly, I would just go to Oxyrhynchus Papyri website and search for Homer. You're going to see 2nd century BC. Now Caesar's accurate, and Caesar is not well attested, but it's because Caesar's in Rome. They don't have papyri. The stuff is wet. It doesn't get preserved, right? I get that. He wasn't being read in Egypt because he tried to conquer it. The Aristotle is wrong. Yeah, I would say this is either on a date or, yeah. Here's the thing, don't believe anything you read on the internet. I'm not actually joking. There's a reason it's free. Well, if you really want to follow up, there's a really good post on this. There's a blog called Evangelical Textual Criticism, which is an interesting name. Like, what is evangelical textual criticism? But it's all, I mean, I know all the guys, they're all good guys, but they're all evangelicals who do textual criticism. They actually, a couple of times, have like blasted this to bits. Peter Head did it once, P. Curry, kind of the typical oversimplistic arguments about the reliability of the text over and against other texts. Just go to evangelical textual criticism and look up, I just say, I don't know, classical text or something, do a search, and they'll just blow it to bits. Yeah, sorry. Anything else?
Can you say something more about Erasmus and the
Yeah, let me get there. It's the next slide, see? I had it coming. Fixing the text in print, the Reformation and later editions. All right, so printing press changed everything, as we all know, just like the internet is changing everything today. For better or for worse, it remains to be determined, right? But the Reformation and Renaissance, really Renaissance, which the Reformation was a result of, their big theme was ad fontes, right? To the sources, to the sources. Chemnitz, I was struck when I reread Chemnitz a couple years ago. He talks about the fontibus all the time. The pure fountains, the true fountains, by going back to the Greek. It's all over Chemnitz in his response to Trent. But again, it's realizing, really, because they're getting access to resources, manuscripts that they didn't have access to before, that, oh, well, the New Testament was actually written in Greek. And, oh, even in some of our monasteries, some of these things got left behind, from 1,000 years ago, and we can read them, We can learn Greek. They had to learn Greek, for Pete's sake. They had to learn Hebrew. Melanchthon, was a Hebrew teacher. So go back to the sources. The Vulgate is not good enough. You know, the papal claims about its authority turn out to be fakes. You know, all this stuff is going on. The problem was they were still in Western Europe, Northern Europe. They still don't have access to stuff generally in Italy, right, because they're Protestant. They don't have access to stuff in Turkey because that's Islamic. They certainly don't have access to stuff in Israel or Egypt, where all the good stuff was found 300 years later. So while they're going back to the sources, it's the sources that are available to them. Generally things left in monasteries from the various wanderings over the years. And there were some pretty cool things, but it's still pretty random. Again, because the West stopped using Greek after about 250. So why make Greek copies, okay? So the first printed Bible is, of course, Gutenberg, 1460, and it's a Latin Vulgate. It's designed to look like a handmade manuscript, obviously, because that's what sells. So it looks like a 15th century Latin text. The black is printed, the coloration is all handmade, just like an illumination would be in a typical manuscript. This was not a revolution, by the way. The price of a Gutenberg Bible was the same, you know, how do you judge a price? Was the same as a fashionable house in the city of Amsterdam in the 15th century. So you can buy a nice house or you can buy a Gutenberg Bible, right? You and I would not have owned a Bible in the 15th century. It's a luxury item and not for common consumption. Heck, it's in Latin, right? Most of the people who bought it couldn't read it. It's just to put on their coffee table for when the pastor came over. All right. Things changed, though, really beginning with Erasmus. So, and we can talk a lot about this, but I'll try to give you the highlights, and Dave, if you want more, we can talk. The first published, is what I should have said, published New Testament, that is the one you could buy, was Erasmus in 1516. It's a great story. This is the good old days when biblical scholars were like the rock stars and rap stars, you know. So Erasmus was this huge scholar, and Henry VIII wanted to make Cambridge an alternative to Oxford. So he basically paid Erasmus a whole ton of money to come to Cambridge and hang out and be like this guest professor. So he spent all his time just doing what all professors do and having a lot of fun, right? So he's in Cambridge, he's doing his thing, and he gets this letter from a publisher in Basel who says, I hear that this group in Spain is trying to put out a Greek New Testament. If you come and give me a Greek New Testament, I'll pay you lots of money. So he gets this letter and he says, oh, all right. And he'd already been working on this, but his goal was to sell his new translation into Latin and prove that his translation was better than the Vulgate. Well, to do that, you need a Greek text to show what you're translating from. So Erasmus said, all right, we'll do the Greek thing, but I'll also put my Latin translation in and show the Catholic Church how wrong they are, because I'm a great humanist. So the first New Testament was printed in 1516, and Erasmus, I used to know the dates, I think it was, he got the letter in October, or he came to Basel in October, and the New Testament was out, I think, 6 months later. What he did was, he went to the monastery of Basel, they're still there, these manuscripts. He grabbed the Greek manuscripts that were there, and he edited them and gave them to the printer. Let me show you a picture. Here's the Gospel of John. Yeah, here's the Gospel of John, 2 columns, notice it's Greek and Latin. The Greek looks just like a Greek manuscript because that's what he had. The Latin is his new translation. And the title of this is actually not Novum Testamentum, but Novum Instrumentum. It's a new tool for studying the text, right? He's intentionally trying to undermine the Vulgate. This first edition, I think there were only about 2,000 copies printed, so it's pretty rare. We have 2 of them actually in Oklahoma City. But the manuscript he used, he had 2 manuscripts. He used one as the base text, and then one to fix the errors. And this is amazing now. But here's his Greek manuscript. It's Matthew, this is Matthew 16, I think it is. There's or Matthew 18, I think it's 16. You see the little dagger? Well, this manuscript had accidentally lost some text, so he put the little dagger in there and then wrote what should be there above it. So that's Erasmus's handwriting on the manuscript. And this is what he physically gives to the printer to produce his Greek text. So you can imagine what happened in the printing office where they have no idea what Greek is. They're trying to match up these squiggles. And it was, I mean, he got it out, he got his money, they sold it, you know. But even he, when he put out his second edition in 1519, says that the first edition, his phrase, was precipitated rather than edited, right? Bruce Metzger calls it the worst printed book ever produced. There's so many mistakes, it's unbelievable, right? So he fixed all the mistakes in the second edition. Luther used that. He kept revising it in 1522, 1525. I think 1528 is when he inserted the Comma Ioanneum. We'll talk about that tomorrow. But again, you got to keep in mind that Erasmus is simply taking whatever manuscript is on hand in Basel and giving it to the printer. Just happened to be an 11th century Greek manuscript, and that's what we got as the first Greek New Testament. Right? It's not because he had access to 2nd century manuscripts or 4th century manuscripts, did this evaluation of the manuscripts and produced the edited text. He simply grabbed the manuscript and produced it. Now, I'm sounding critical, but that's what everybody did in the Renaissance. They were happy to have a manuscript to be able to make a text from. I mean, this is standard practice. Every first edition of a classical author is exactly the same thing. Somebody finds a manuscript and they rush to print it. Okay. Go back a little bit here. Yeah. So this becomes hugely influential. It becomes the Protestant Bible, even though Erasmus is Roman Catholic, at least he thinks he is. This is the one used by Luther. Tyndale used the same edition. And Tyndale is also kind of cribbing off Luther. You can see where his translation is mimicking Luther. The King James translators use this as the basis, at least the later version of it, in 1611. And again, it's because it basically won the market. The edition that was being produced in Spain started being printed in 1514, and it's a phenomenal project. It's a 6-volume Old Testament, Apocrypha, New Testament, lexicon, and concordance in the last volume. It's like an entire Logos software thing in 6 volumes for the 16th century. They printed Hebrew, Greek, and Latin Old Testament, Greek and Latin New Testament. I mean, it's a phenomenal thing. It just took them 7 years to produce. And they didn't get the imprimatur in time and all this, so Erasmus beat them to market. And their Greek text is pretty much the same as Erasmus, although they had slightly better manuscripts. And so their text is actually, if you want to evaluate it, probably better than Erasmus's, although not that different. It's certainly more accurate. But again, that's the Roman Catholic Bible, and it was so expensive, not many people could afford it. It just wasn't influential. Whereas Erasmus was, 1 volume, boom, you make copies and you make lots of money, and it won the market. By 1550, it's called the Textus Receptus. This is actually a marketing term. This is back when they printed posters to sell Greek New Testaments. And the poster said, this is the text having been received by everybody, the Textus Receptus. So it's actually an advertising slogan, and we still use it today. But there you see it's beautiful, nicely printed, just full of mistakes. There's Erasmus's notes. Now again, this text is based on 3 manuscripts because Erasmus had one for the Gospels, one for the Pauline epistles, and one for the Catholic epistles, just like we had in the 2nd century. None of his manuscripts were earlier than the 12th century, and nobody knew that there were older manuscripts. Again, Western Europe simply didn't have access to anything older at this point. They didn't have any idea that the text had undergone development. They were using 400-year-old, 300-year-old manuscripts. It's awesome, right? But now we know it wasn't as awesome as it could have been. So they were using what was at hand. However, this is the basis of all translations from 1516 to 1880. Everything produced in the Protestant world for the next, 350 years is based on this Greek text. Okay. So how would you like to be the first people to produce a new one? Yeah. Dave, you want to say anything more about Luther? Yeah. Luther taught himself, actually Luther, one note, he had Erasmus's text, also had sort of as the second half his annotations, which were his like philological notes, sometimes lexicographical notes, syntax. He was a phenomenal Greek scholar. And some of his conjectures, that is, he says in a couple places, I think this is not what the Greek should actually say, it should be this. And then 200 years later, they find a manuscript that has it, and now that's what our printed text says. So he was a phenomenal scholar. He just put everything in the back. And Luther, you can tell some of his translation choices, he just flipped to the back and did what Erasmus said to do. The guy did a study on this. So Luther's using all his tools. He's really, heavily dependent on Erasmus. Of course, then 3 years later, they get the whole bondage of the will thing. But terminology, we've just gotten better at using more neutral terminology to describe this. But again, having said that, the new readings we're finding are not sort of radically different. All right, thanks. See you guys in the morning.